Thinking about your experience is exciting. It feels like an intimate page ripped out of a journal. But talking about that experience and sharing it is disorienting. It's cerebral and strange and makes you feel like you were a witness to something that you'd been a player in. It imposes this strange third-person perspective on something that was lived through a first-person point of view. Thinking to my own time back home is strange in a similar way because it feels like I am trying to hold together something that had held a tangible life energy, and I'm looking at it retrospectively. But in doing that, I hope I can trace things to the core of their experiences and help that core chart my way forward. Home for me was an amazing place of an incessant ebb and flow, an ebb and flow of people and an ebb and flow of energies. At age 8, I moved into a Gurukul, Sanskrit for an Atelier, a communal space of artists, musicians, architects living together, and in that manifesting this exciting sporadicity that informed every single member of this highly permeable grouping of people. Because a lot of the people that would raise me, I would never see again. It was in that split second of, will this person be a part of my life for a day, or will they spend the rest of the year with us, that I had to find a space for myself. Life in a Gurukul was seen through the lens of imbibing the ways in which your guru bhais, and your guru behens, members of the Gurukul, led their lives. The philosophy behind the right way of learning skill or technique and art or music was seen through the lens of learning the tenets of life living employed by your guru, as if that prefaced all else. If your guru thought it was a fine idea for you to wake up at 3 a.m. and run 15 laps outside the forest outside your home, you did that. If they thought it was a good idea for you to join them and 5 other instrumentalists on stage while they performed in front of an audience of hundreds and you sat there without an instrument, you did that too. You did that not out of compulsion or because you felt like you were forced to or that you had to, but because of that exciting energy that manifested in living with this group of people. Because living with and around this energy, I feel, really taught you to live like yourself. Sitting on stage without an instrument is one of the strangest, most surreal experiences one can have. If playing the sitar for me on stage was an exercise in manifesting and conjuring a performer's bravado and curbing self-criticism, I feel like sitting on stage without an instrument was like that, but turned up 15 dials. When I'd sit on stage with the sitar, I'd be there as myself performing for an audience. I would hone in, look myopically at what I was doing, think of what I was saying. But imagine sitting idly in front of that same exact audience. I think experientially, it has a lot in common with being raised by an eclectic grouping of people, in that it puts you at odds with how you think things ought to be. It puts you in a heady space of gauging your experience against a normative context. I feel like a lot of us design our lives such that we face the least possible resistance in things we set out to do. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but if someone were to tell me that the way I was learning art or music was a lazy cop-out because I was exploring certain questions that lived in a certain space and didn't impact anything outside of that space too profoundly, I wouldn't agree with them. I'd say, learning art is about humility, isn't it? It's about learning to be good at things and being okay with being bad at them before you get good at them. But that's sort of exactly what I mean. We consecrate these neatly conjured spaces where we can provoke a confined sort of anxiety. I might be anxious about my skill as an instrumentalist or my skill as a painter, but that isn't necessarily an anxiety that chips away at that border that I've created for it. Not at least in the sense that certain experiences help you. My guru would use sometimes what were kooky and loony and downright strange examples of showing me his understandings of the truths of life. Things like putting me on stage without an instrument, or embarrassing himself in public to show me that propriety was a false notion. It was fabricated and constructed in the minds of people. Things don't have to be like anything. Learning the sitar was learning to be okay with the fact that the person crashing in your room was a complete stranger, and the person coming in after her would be a complete stranger too, and being okay with that. Being okay with loving them and honestly loving yourself, irrespective of that. It was in being an 8-year-old shoulder for a fully grown adult to cry on and whine on, and then seeking that same shoulder from a complete stranger that you hadn't met a few hours ago. And often 8-year-old me would think, life shouldn't have to be this way. I shouldn't have to learn to love a person I didn't get along with and be okay with losing a person that I was very attached to. That isn't how things are for other people. That isn't how things should be. Living with this eclectic grouping of people was activating certain sensibilities that only were activated under a dome. This eclectic grouping of artists and musicians operated in a disjointed manner. They were disconnected from society in certain senses. They weren't who my friends would think of when they think of familyhood, parenthood, childhood, and a myopic understanding of that and your role in it. Making relationships with fully realized individuals when you weren't one was also my initiation into a space of a lot of anxiety. It was my initiation into a crossroads wherein I would always look at experiences that I was having and compare them with others. I would think of what it could be like, what it should be like, versus what it was like. And what it was like was a mixed bag at times. I hated parts of my experience. I hated having to be okay with liking a person that I didn't even get along with and losing people that I felt very, very attached to. One of my first friendships was with a pundit, big pharma chief financial officer, an Eagles and Steely Dan scored chanting 35-year-old University of Pennsylvania graduate who force converted me into a religious fervent for an entire year when I was 10 years old. Things got odd and things got out of control, but I didn't think of what odd and out of control meant for me. I never thought of what lens it could be looked through. Something to make sense of the strange experiences I was receiving. But isn't every experience strange in virtue of the subjective context that give rise to it? Isn't every experience strange because it's all you? Something I found particularly challenging growing up in India was charting a queer identity that felt my own. I would often look at how queerness was expressed normatively by other queer people and not how it manifested in me and me myself. I mean, that is on top of the incredibly fraught dynamic of coming to terms with your gender identity in a space that's heteronormative and largely transphobic. What is the right way of self-expression? I felt like that paralleled 8-year-old me's question of what the right way of living in a family unit was. Could I and my family really be an open space that would welcome any and every person that wanted to join us? Well, something we did as a Gurukul was we would open our doors to artists and students that were traveling and that probably didn't have the funds to finance their own stay. Artists in India are often trained in the artisanal craft of their families. And in this generational passing down of art and craft, there is also, unfortunately, a generational passing down of the social stigmas that plague popular perceptions of artists in South Asia. Stigmas that paint them as intellectually inferior to members that are more akin to the Western understanding of the social interface. Time spent learning the sitar was time spent in the space of observing community disregard and, honestly, outright oppression of an amazingly emotive, spiritually in tune, and incredibly intuitive grouping of people that were constantly looked down upon. That is, in many senses, the singular state of Indian classical music, a vastly underfunded venture where artists are seen as second to all and artisanal work in music is looked down upon from a colonially imbued perspective of superiority. Life spent learning the sitar was time spent making do with the resources that I'd been given. I was lucky that I'd been given resources at all. In Indian classical music, most beginners aren't given access to guidance or resources when they start out. There's really nothing melodramatic about having to play at a railway platform the morning before a concert later that night because you didn't have the funds to rent out a hotel room for the day. And honestly, there was nothing melodramatic about not being able to hear the sitar do well over the sounds of the Mumbai railway station at 8 in the morning. But 12-year-old me thought in the most, oh, woe is me fashion that I'd been dealt the hardest cards ever. In hindsight, I feel like there was a way to look at that experience, something to make sense of it, and something that would have helped crystallize it. Something that would have removed this greener pastures, other worlds attitude that prevailed much of my thinking, that prevails much of our collective thinking, I feel, and inhibits a lot of us from coming to our own. Odd as this may sound, I feel like in the last 10 years, I have reconfigured how I look at normativity. So much changes when you think truly that you are the singular manifestation of an amazingly hyper-specific set of circumstances and experiences that were only processed in the ways that they have been by you and you alone. The outward projections of this manifestation need not be gauged with or against a fabricated, constructed, false notion of how things ought to be. You are who you are, and you can live in that. You can learn to love the Hungarian radio jockey that comes and crashes in your room every 2 years, and you can learn to not be embarrassed of sitting on stage without an instrument. Because that is all there is to things, and maybe that is all there is to life, is a performance without an instrument. Thank you.